the Pope is obviously somebody who has immense political influence in the world and has an immense power for good and not so good, I guess. But it's definitely a position that I respect as an important one in world politics. And so it's interesting to get into this book that is all about electing a new pope and all these ancient traditions around it and how unlike most political processes it is, right? And that it really comes down to these cardinals. And yet this book at its core is a political thriller. Welcome, friends, to episode 347 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss Robert Harris's 2016 novel, Conclave. So, we just had a new pope elected, or named. Are they elected? I don't know. Terminology is going to be difficult for this one. Announced, chosen by God, I guess. In what's his name? Pope Leo the 14th, I think yeah. But he's American. He's from Chicago. So there's been lots of fun stuff on the internet about that.
I mean, we should probably give some of our backgrounds so that people understand kind of where we're coming from.
I just wanted to say, so like the new pope, and then there's this movie Conclave that I've been hearing about. And like people who I know who I wouldn't have expected to like a movie that was all about like religion and Catholicism were telling me it was a good film and that I should check it out. And then at some point along the way, I found out it was an adaptation, and I was like, oh crap, we could actually cover this on the podcast. So trying to set up to where that's why we came to where we're actually covering this thing. I was raised Catholic, but am no longer Catholic. I now call myself an agnostic, and that's my belief system, I guess, in that I don't think it is possible to know whether or not God exists. But that's just kind of table setting for this conversation. I want to know where you're at with it. Have you seen this movie already?
I have not seen the movie.
Okay.
I almost watched it. I probably should have, because I try to see all the films that are nominated each year, but there's a lot of them.
It's good that you didn't, because now both of us can go into it blind.
Yeah, it'll be cool. This is interesting because, again, this is probably not our typical fare.
Definitely not.
This is a story that, on the surface, I was not very interested in reading.
Right.
I was.
That's why I didn't see it. I was like, I'm not interested in this.
You mentioned that you're agnostic. I'm also agnostic. And I also have, like, a certain, outside of my belief system of, like, you can't know these kinds of things, and the fact that I can't believe in something in that way. The church systems and a lot of, like, what's gone on with it is something that bothered me growing up in a Christian household as well, that like I never could wrap my mind around. And I wasn't raised Catholic, and then I have friends who are. I've been a part of Catholic weddings, so I've seen a lot of kind of what goes on with Catholicism, but I don't know the names, the differences between cardinals and bishops.
I don't either.
And all that kind of stuff, and all of this ritual. I think it's interesting fare for telling a story, and we've talked about some religious projects that have at least
religious
some religious
themes. Like, yeah.
And I've mentioned before, like, it's kind of for a certain section of people, there's like universal things that are baked into the story, whether you believe in these things or not, and like the baggage that comes with that. And so reading a story like this, I do think, and I have to correlate it to things that I've seen and read before, but this is like, take all of the trappings of that kind of a story, and then blend it with like a 12 Angry Men, where like it's a bunch of old guys trapped in a room, fighting over it with mounting tensions and factions and things like that. And it actually made for a really compelling story, and went places that I wouldn't have expected. And it kept my attention more than I would have expected. So yeah, I think those people who recommended this, I think they were onto something. I think it's cool that we're covering something kind of off type for us.
And I'm excited to see the movie because there's definitely a visual appeal to a lot of the Catholic trimmings, right? Like beautiful structures, the architecture is amazing. Like I can imagine, the ways you could play with light and you can shoot these scenes are probably going to be really engaging. The costumes are probably quite extravagant and interesting. Then there's this whole air of things being a little bit like sacrilegious, like, taboo. You're going against something that's such an established system. And you're not really going against it, I guess, but like the way in talking about it in this way is not something that's typically done. So it's like walking that line Whereas, like, I do think there are probably Catholics out there who would love this book and who do love this book and love this movie. But I think that it was also made to appeal to everybody to some extent. So
Not knowing the intention of the story and just thinking, oh, this is going to be a story about the appointment of a new pope. That sounds like something that could have a fair amount of drama to it. But the places that this story goes, I think it has a lot. Like you said, maybe in the way that it's sacrilegious, and maybe in the way that it's like almost a little blasphemous, or like, I don't know, like opening the curtain too much on things that are supposed to be kind of secretive.
Yeah.
But then that's something about the Catholic Church, and I think even some of its strongest supporters would say like some of the secrecy and there needs to be some transparency there. And I think the story is like maybe giving you some of that as like a morality tale within these kind of like important, whether you believe it or not, as far as like what it represents in a weird way. And we're seeing that currently with the appointment of a new pope. Like I didn't know or really care that we never had an American pope. I guess that made sense.
Yeah.
And then to appoint one and everyone get all excited about it, I was like, I guess it's kind of interesting, but I'm also more curious about like what good he can do for the world. And I think that's what a lot of people get kind of wrapped up in, is like, are they going to be very, like this story goes into, very conservative, liberal, like in terms of like how they're trying to push the church, and then the power of that for the people who believe, and like where that actually does affect the world.
I like the idea that he was nominated as an avenging pope who's going to take out J.D. Vance for assassinating the previous pope.
All right. Yeah, it's objectively funny. Yes.
Anyway. That's a whole internet thing, if you're not familiar, that J.D. Vance like met with the last pope, I guess like a couple days before he died or something, and so people are like,
I think that he's like the last person to meet him, I think, or something. Yeah.
And that this guy, the new guy, has been critical of J.D. Vance in the past. So they're like, they directly nominated him because of that.
I was terrified, and this is outside of him being an American. I was just terrified that with the way that the world is going right now, we were going to have some like really extreme authoritarian pope come in.
Yeah,
and
really
like,
hardline conservative type traditionalist, I guess they would call it.
And I honestly don't know where this guy lands. I
think he's, from what I've seen, more of a moderate, but that's all to be taken with a grain of salt because it's deeply religious people. So it's always kind of messy. I don't know, though. I don't know a ton about him. I'm still learning some about him. Again, it's not something I follow super closely because it is a religion I was raised in, but then deliberately walked away from. So, it's not something I'm as interested in keeping up with because it's like no longer a part of my life. But I did go through confirmation.
Me too.
When I
probably not the same kind of confirmation.
Yeah, I guess it might be different.
Yeah.
Depending on your background, I guess.
I had to take classes and know things and that kind of thing.
I was gonna say I did an after school program. I think when I was in elementary school, I'm not sure what grade I stopped going at. I think it led up to my confirmation, and that was kind of like you graduating from it. You like learned everything. I think it was like once a week I would go to this.
Yeah. I did it like middle school, I think is around the time that I was like confirmed.
I feel like I was done by the time I was in middle school. Okay. But I'm not sure. Regardless, I know that was for me, like people talk about, I know this is only somewhat related to the book at hand, but I think it's good table setting because like, I don't want to come at this and people to expect us to provide some sort of insight we're incapable of, or come at this from the point of view of like staunch believers. I want to like
even historians. Like we're not, we don't live in this world. It's just an interesting setting for a story for us.
So it feels important for me to kind of like state where I'm at with my faith, sure. I guess, in as quickly a way as I can. But confirmation for me and going to that after school program was like the most I was attending church. Cause like my family would go to church, but it was probably like a few times a year. Maybe when I was really young, we went a little more than that. But we didn't go every Sunday or anything like that. And so going to that, because it was at a church, was the most I was like dealing with religion and going and in these classes learning about it and studying the Bible, I guess. And this was where like people talk about how faith is something that like comes from within and is like sort of rejects rational appeals that try and like tell you that maybe it's inaccurate or maybe you shouldn't believe it. It's like, no, it's like it's deep within and people hold it deep within and it's kind of immune to that sort of stuff. And this was for me where I realized that I had the opposite of that and that I have a deep seated skepticism about the world and about institutions and things that are told to me as being true, I'm always like curious, like, well, why, and like, and who says that that's the case, and where do these stories come from, and who wrote them down, and all these things, right? Like, how do we know that this is true? Like, and just that level of skepticism has always been deep seated for me, to where even though I was being presented with all these truths about the supposed truths about the church, part of me was always sitting there with my arms crossed, going like, well, how do I know that this is true? Like, why should I believe this? And I never felt like anyone was giving me sufficient reason to believe it, other than telling me like, you just believe it in your heart. And when someone tells you that, but you don't, you're like, well, what's going on here? And I think that's like where it really led to me. Cause like by the time I was done doing confirmation and like all that, like I was pretty much done with the religion, and I was, so young, I didn't really have like the words to say that. And I wasn't necessarily telling anybody that, but I'd already kind of decided that I didn't believe any of this.
Yeah. Similar kind of situation for me. I think that skepticism was a big part of it, but also getting into like some of the fallibility of like man being ingrained in the religion, and then into, the ways that I just truly felt like I wasn't able to, like, I don't know, praying and all these other things that you would do. I always felt like I was playing a role. I always felt like, and like I was so young that I didn't understand necessarily why that was. And it's interesting, like I distanced myself, like, around, I would say around middle school, definitely by high school. And like looking back, I wasn't ever able to like really pinpoint an exact moment, but it was always wrapped around like a fair amount of like skepticism and like not feeling like I was being a genuine person in terms of like what I was doing and saying. Some videos that I've seen too, and I think we may have sent these around to each other, but Rhett McLaughlin from Rhett and Link, surprisingly, has these really cool deconstructed kind of stories about his religion.
He was an evangelical,
analyzed them. Yeah, and I wasn't evangelical, I was Methodist, but it's like, which like that, his version is more, going up to people and like trying to pull them into the religion. Mine was my experience with that was like, we were going every Sunday. I was going on weekdays, sometimes at night. I was going to youth group stuff. Like I was pretty ingrained. And at some point I just like, I was going to camps for weeks at a time and stuff, like, and at some point I realized like, this isn't, like, I don't believe any of this. In the same way that you said, like, someone telling you something and how you should feel it, it never, like, rang true for me. And I just didn't sit right with me. Yeah. And eventually I like, had a schism with it. And honestly, it's funny, too, because, like, outside of all of that, the, like, corruptibility of the church and a lot of, like, the organized religions that like, I went on to study. Like, in college, I took, world religion and like, some of those classes. And, like, those were things to me that never sat well as well. And specifically, like, maybe some of the hypocritical nature of, like, the people who are trying to tell you and imbue you with all of these things, and then you're seeing the fallibility in them and how it's not, it never comes out clean. And to me, I just saw too much hypocrisy and too much of me trying to play a role that I eventually like got out of that.
Sure. And then there's also like, there's so many different things you can look at, like, why is there so much suffering in the world if these things are true and God really cares about everybody? And then there's like, why is the religion that I happen to be born into like the one true religion and everybody else is wrong? Like, isn't it kind of convenient that I happen to be born in a family that happens to worship a certain way, and this is the right way and every other way is wrong, and all those people are going to hell? And like, there's so many different avenues that made sense to me that are like, I just don't believe this. It just feels too convenient and too easy. And it being so convenient and easy, and just the way it like gives people narratives to tell themselves to make themselves feel better, like that to me was pretty obviously self-serving. Like, I don't want to feel bad about death, so I'm going to tell myself a story about death that makes it easier to deal with. And like, I see the appeal of that, but that doesn't make it true. And I think there was always part of me that didn't believe it for that reason too.
Yeah, there's a level of like it being a scapegoat for like many things in life, and then just
it gives
to
you
talk
answers,
about like,
that's what religion does, right? It gives you answers for everything.
Yeah, and wars have been fought over this, and people have died, and like all of that is just to say that like this story is showing these people that are in the highest roles possible. I know this is a fictitious version of events, but the fallibility of man is there, and inherently like people have doubt, people have all these other things within them, like corruption and vying for power in some sense, and like the way that like there's good morality to a lot of this religion to an extent, but then it also can be like a lever of control and like
in some ways there's some good morality and some not so good morality, right?
Correct.
It depends on your perspective, I suppose.
Well, I just mean in terms of like, if we're just talking like 10 Commandments, and we're just going, Old Testament,
Jesus Christ,
sure, yeah, they be
Jesus Christ and as an ethicist is interesting, or talking about morality is an interesting, but a lot of that gets lost in all the trappings of it, right? Yeah,
exactly.
So let's move on to talking about Robert Harris in the book. But I just wanted to kind of set the table. Is like that's where we're at, and that's where we're going to come at this from. And interestingly, when I was researching this, and you mentioned you were curious about Robert Harris's beliefs, I think this is a good time to bring that up. This is what he had to say. Talking about the book, he said, "It has been an interesting and enlightening book to work on." And then asked about his own relationship with faith, he said, "I'm not religious, not a Catholic. I have respect towards faith with an active imagination and had to get inside the heads of men of faith. I hope I've reflected that adequately." He added, "I was given some help by the Catholic Church. I was shown all the locations that I wanted to see." So he actually went and like toured a lot of these locations.
Wow.
And he had a cardinal who was like helping him and giving him details about this stuff. So it's very accurate in that sense. And he had a lot of access. And it sounds like he wanted to respect it, but he doesn't consider himself Catholic and he doesn't consider himself particularly religious.
And that's one thing I'll say too, as much as we've kind of just dunked on religion as a whole so far. Like there's something to be
there's I'm something giving my own take.
Yeah. I feel like I was dunking on it. And from my perspective, sometimes rightfully so.
Yeah.
But having a level of respect and like respecting one's religion, what they choose to do with it, and if you're truly following these teachings and what they can mean, I do have a certain level, like someone who can dedicate themselves to a cause like this and do it for the betterment of mankind as a whole. Like that's a good thing to strive for. It just, when it's wrapped up in some of this other stuff, for me personally, it's never going to mean what it means to someone like that. But it's like someone being a monk, right? It's like if you go into to a monastery and you become a monk, like there's something very like noble about that, and like that's an impressive kind of
dedication,
life to
lead. Commitment to a certain ideal and belief structure around life. Like the Pope is obviously somebody who has immense political influence in the world and has an immense power for good and not so good, I guess. But it's definitely a position that I respect as an important one in world politics. And so it's interesting to get into this book that is all about electing a new pope and the power that's going to come with it, and how all these ancient traditions around it and how unlike most political processes it is, right? And that it really comes down to these cardinals. And yet this book at its core is a political thriller, and it is all about like garnering votes and like almost campaigning for all this stuff, but like you're also not supposed to, because you're not supposed to have personal ambition, but people do. And like you've talked about, it's like it deeply humanizes these cardinals as they're trying to win this position that would declare them as sort of beyond human in a sense, right? Like,
well, it's like the voice of God
on earth. Yeah, exactly. And so it's weird because like these are very human people with very human ambitions, and yet they're not supposed to have human ambitions. And you can see sort of there's some inherent conflicts there, and it definitely gives you insight into a very secret situation that I don't think a lot of us know much about outside of reading this book or learning about it in this way. So it's cool in that sense. It gives you an insight into a thing that I didn't know about.
Totally, yeah. And that secrecy too, like it runs so deep and for so many decades and centuries at this point, that like it's like a historical look at times, and it's also like,
well, it has like personal journal entries from popes at like the start of the book talking about like the weight of it. It's interesting to hear that, right? Because it gives you insight to like this is a person ultimately.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about like if this is, and this is again my personal perspective on like the kinds of stories that I like to read. If this was somehow wrapped up in like a fantasy novel or something, and this is like a fictitious world with like not something that has all the baggage of all these like sex crimes that have happened in the Catholic Church and all this other stuff,
which
that's like deeply troubling
in this book,
deeply troubling, like horrific stuff. If it was like wrapped up in a fantasy story, I'm like, I love this kind of stuff in a fantasy story. I'm like, give me this like fake religion and how like zealous.
Well, because often the religions are like demonstrably true in fantasy novels, right? Like, 'cause usually
Sure.
there's magic in the world, which seems like a manifestation of something true, right? So it's hard to argue that there's something, maybe they're misunderstanding it, which is, a whole different thing. But yeah, I'm with you, man. And honestly, that makes me think of, I've been playing Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which I know might be kind of a deep pull for people out there. But if you know about video games, it's this like,
people have that listed for like possible game of the year.
I
Like,
think
it's up
so,
there right
man.
now.
I think it needs more attention. I'm loving it. I'm still playing it. It just had a DLC come out. But what makes me think of with this is because it's a historical game that is kind of Skyrim-esque, and it's the way that it plays. But you're in a like pretty meticulously made version of like 14th century Bohemia, and it's trying to be really accurate to the time, and the technology, and how people lived, and all this stuff, right? And Christianity is like omnipresent because it was such a big part of life in that time, and the way people believed in it is kind of different than how they believe in it today, because it was this like old way in believing in religion. It was so fundamental to who you are and into your life. And the way that game deals with it reminds me of like a fantasy religion, and like you can get a buff from like praying at a shrine and stuff, and like so it's kind of gamifying Christianity in a way. And so like I'm able to have fun with it, even though it's not something I personally believe in. I kind of like the way that like it makes sense that my character would, because that's just the world he lived in at this time. Like everybody believed in it in this area.
Yeah, compelling storytelling is compelling storytelling, even if you wrap it up in something that I'm not interested in, like Catholicism and Christianity.
I wouldn't have thought I'd be interested in that, but it works really well in the game. And much like that, that's how this book is, right? Because it's a subject I didn't think I was going to be interested in, but like it took a little bit. I would say like early on, I found it a little dry. And it wasn't until things really started ramping up and the first sort of major scandal got revealed where I was kind of really hooked into the story and like really enjoying it. So I'll be curious to see if like I feel like there might be ways in the movie that they can hook you early in a way that maybe the book didn't quite, but we'll see. I'll be curious.
To put a cap on that too, like the way that you were talking about like getting a buff in the game, it was interesting to get like the perspective of some of these cardinals in this scenario and how like they are actively interacting with God in the way that they're like to me in a fictitious way, but they're interacting with God in ways where it's like something happens and they're like, was that a message from God? Am I interpreting this? And they can feel the spirit within themselves. And I'm like, well, again, I've never felt that. I don't believe it. Mm-hmm. The fact that a character in a book is like,
I believe that people do feel that way.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, and this book definitely comes into the idea of like that powerful feeling, is being interpreted by a human, and like, does it convince you that the things you're doing are just, even if maybe they're against the rules, and like you can see different characters maybe believing they're doing God's will, and that justifying their actions, which is something that happens all the time in religion. So yeah, very interesting. So before we get into the actual plot of the book, which we're going to get into here soon. I want to talk about Robert Harris a little bit, because this guy's actually a pretty famous author that I didn't realize was someone who I'm at least like tangentially familiar with some of his work, although I don't know if I've ever seen an adaptation made from any of his stuff. But he's had a bunch of them, so maybe you've seen some of them.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you know who Roman Polanski is.
Yes.
He has some connections with him that we'll talk about.
Oh, interesting. Well...
Yeah.
That's not good.
Yeah. So Robert Harris was born in 1957. He is a British novelist and former journalist. Although he began his career in journalism and nonfiction, he is best known for his works of historical fiction, beginning with the bestseller Fatherland. Harris has focused on events surrounding the Second World War, and followed by his book set in ancient Rome. His later works are varied in settings, but mostly set after 1870. So he's written in all kinds of different time periods about different subjects, but I think it's interesting to note his background in journalism, his background in writing about historical events, definitely kind of approaches these as a historian. He's written a lot of nonfiction books I was seeing too, so which I think that all kind of makes sense for the way this book is written, right? Because there's a definite eye towards accuracy and factual accuracy in a lot of this stuff.
And media, there kept being like talks of media and journalism and some of that stuff. Interesting how that tied in with possibly with his background and how he would see them having to operate around these kind of like sensitive scenarios.
Mm-hmm. Robert Harris spent his childhood in a small rented house on a Nottingham council estate. His ambition to become a writer arose at an early age from visits to the local printing plant where his father worked. So he was around printing early on. It made him want to be a writer. He would go on to study at Cambridge. After leaving Cambridge, he joined the BBC and worked on news and current affair programs such as Panorama and Newsnight In 1987, at the age of 30, he became the political editor of the newspaper The Observer, and he would later write regular columns for the Sunday Times and the Daily Telegraph. So, like, legit, pretty big deal publications. 1982, he would co-write his first book, A Higher Form of Killing, with fellow BBC journalist Jeremy Paxman. This was the study of chemical and biological warfare, so this was a nonfiction book. He would follow it up with a bunch of other nonfiction books that I'm not going to name. Let's move on to his fiction, because that's what we're here for. So his best-selling first novel was called Fatherland. This is an alternative history where Nazi Germany won the Second World War, published in 1992, and would be adapted into a television film by HBO in 1994. So got a TV adaptation. He has later stated that the proceeds from this book enabled him to buy a former vicarage in Berkshire that he jokingly dubbed the house that Hitler built, where he still lives. Wow. So having a little fun with that, I guess. Now, he would write several other books that have been adapted, so I'm only going to talk about the ones that have been adapted. He wrote Enigma in 1995. It was adapted as a film by writer Tom Stoppard, starring Dougray Scott and Kate Winslet in 2001. Then he wrote Archangel, which was another international bestseller. It was adapted as a television film by the BBC, starring Daniel Craig in 2005. He then started writing these series of books about ancient Rome. This began with his book Pompeii. He would write several more books set in this like ancient Roman period, and this was one of the things that made him interested in Rome as a place, which would influence later writing of Conclave. He followed that up with a book called Imperium. Then I wrote a book called The Ghost, which was notable because he was an early and enthusiastic supporter of Tony Blair, who was a personal acquaintance of his, and a donor to the New Labour Party. But the war in Iraq blunted his enthusiasm. Basically, they had a falling out over the war in Iraq. In 2007, after Blair resigned, Harris dropped his other work to write The Ghost. The Ghost refers to both a professional ghostwriter whose lengthy memorandum forms the novel, and to his immediate predecessor who, as the action opens, has just drowned in gruesome and mysterious circumstances. So it's about a ghostwriter and, sort of some thrilling things around that. Roman Polanski and Harris adapted the novel into the film The Ghostwriter in 2010. So I don't know if you're familiar with that film at all, but that was his first one where he worked with Roman Polanski. Lustrum, he wrote in 2009. Then he wrote a book called The Fear Index in 2011. This was adapted by Sky Atlantic in 2022 into a 4-part limited series starring Josh Hartnett. He then wrote a book called An Officer and a Spy in 2013. This was again adapted by his friend Roman Polanski, who adapted the film in 2019. So again, would work with Roman Polanski. He wrote a book called The Dictator in 2015, and then this novel, 2016, Conclave. So very prolific. He's writing a book like a year, it sounds like. Obviously, this has been made into a film adaptation starring Ralph Fiennes and Stanley Tucci, a director, Edward Berger. And that's what we'll be covering next week. After this book, he wrote Munich in 2017, but not the Munich that I thought maybe it was, different Munich. This is a thriller set during the negotiations of the 1938 Munich Agreement between Hitler and Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. It was adapted for Netflix as Munich, The Edge of War, starring Jeremy Irons and George McKay in 2022. And he has since written 4 more novels: The Second Sleep 2019, V2 2020, Act of Oblivion 2022, and Precipice 2024. So super prolific, writing all these books. And I mean, you saw the number of adaptations in there. Yeah, no, they're not all huge ones, but like that's a pretty extensive list. He has, however, come under his own criticism for being a defender of Roman Polanski, who he considers a friend, who has famously sort of fled the U.S. to avoid his criminality, basically over drugging and raping a 13-year-old, I believe. And obviously, sorry for potential triggers there, but that's Roman Polanski. If you didn't know, he's definitely someone who is famous for the films he's made. I mean, he directed Rosemary's Baby, and has had a
Others,
wild
yeah.
life,
Chinatown.
was married to Sharon Tate, who got murdered by the Manson family. So just crazy history around this guy, but is a wanted person in the U.S. who can't come back to the U.S. because of it, and yet is still making movies.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, there was a period of time, Woody Allen, same kind of thing, where it was like Hollywood was still working with these guys for a while, and like actors still were, and there was so many defenders, and
I feel
you're
like
like,
they still do, right? Like Roman Polanski's still making movies.
I think so. I think at this time, finally, it's come around to where like most high-level celebrities that you've heard of, actors that you've heard of, aren't really working with him. But then again, I don't know. I'm not, the voice of Hollywood. But it always creeps me out when that kind of stuff happens, because I'm like, where's the line, and why is it not way closer than that?
His one answer about this was kind of bullshit. It was just kind of talking about how culture changes and like, things are different, attitudes are different now, and like stuff like that. And I'm like, I don't know, man. That just sounds like you're making excuses for. I mean, like he's got this working relationship with a guy who made several adaptations for him, and I guess he's wanting to defend it, but it just sounds pretty indefensible to me.
Not something I want to defend personally.
Yeah,
but
So that's Robert Harris. As far as this novel goes, he has said that he was inspired to write this novel about papal politics while watching the coverage of the 2013 papal conclave. At that time, he was working on his Cicero trilogy, a series of novels set during the Roman Republic, and the papal electors reminded him of the Roman Senate. He consulted with Cardinal Cormac McMurphy O'Connor as part of his research for the book, and he later gave McMurphy O'Connor a copy of the novel, and to his surprise, McMurphy O'Connor sent a letter praising its accuracy. That's the story behind him writing it. It really was just like he was watching this play out on the news, and he was curious about it. He'd been writing these books about Rome and about the Roman Senate, and he felt like it was kind of similar. And at this point, he was a big enough name to where it sounds like he was able to reach out to some people at the Vatican and get some pretty unprecedented access, and write this book. And it's an interesting one. We're going to get into all the stuff that happens in here because there are some major twists that we will be spoiling soon. But before we get into that, what's your reaction to hearing about this guy's background?
Mixed bag. I kind of thought I knew what kind of person this was when I read the novel, and it's interesting because like the kind of stories he writes are like very adaptable. I think it's like it reminds me of like spy thrillers or like historical thrillers, like those types of thrillers that come up often. I haven't read any more of his work, so I'm just going off of this specific story. But some of those other ones that you listed off sounded similar. It's the kind of book that you're going to see at the airport bookshelf, and it's like people are going to buy it. There's nothing wrong with that. I think this is a fun story, and I think
they make tons of money.
And but it's interesting, like that sounds like the kind of things that he's writing, and then he's also writing like historical accounts of like these like I don't know, very specific things that sound less like thrillers to me, but maybe he's like imbuing some of that in there. And then hearing the troubling connection to Roman Polanski.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I don't want to, like, I never want to...
Specifically the defending.
Yeah, I never want to, like, it sucks that he defends the guy, but I also don't want to equate that with him having committed the crimes himself, right? Obviously, he's not the one who did it. I just think it's misguided for him to defend his work with, working with Roman Polanski. This was just from one interview. Has he changed his mind over the years? I don't know. This is just the one thing I was able to find. So I definitely disapprove of it. I think it sucks. But I think I'll leave it to everybody on their own to decide how much they want to, dislike this guy over it. Because again, he's not the one who did the crime. He's just, willing to defend the guy somewhat, at least in a press interview about it.
And I'll say, just as far as like right now is concerned, we're talking about like him seeing the 2013 papal ceremony and everything, and that inspiring the story. I think we've gone through 2 or 3 now, maybe 3 or 4 in our lifetime.
Yeah. I want to say at least 3, maybe 4. Yeah.
I think 4 at least, but I'm not sure. Anyway, my point is that in the past, this time it didn't necessarily strike me, but in the past I remember being like, the news was on, seeing like black smoke coming out, and like it was a thing. It's like I don't know, like a royal wedding or something, like things.
Well, again, I was raised Catholic, so like I remember it being a bigger deal when I was growing up, and because like for the long time, even though I didn't believe, like I still like told my family I did, I still like, because that was just like, it was just like, making things easy, like no point in having a fight about it, let's just kind of go with it.
Yeah, the kind of peripheral of that, and like how it is kind of like world of cultural events.
Totally.
Like these are things that are happening.
Well, and the way that the Pope believes politically definitely has a huge influence on the church, which is a major political figure in world politics. So if you have a pope who's like a hardline conservative, that definitely affects the politics around the church.
Yeah, and I'll say like the description of the pope who's passed in this story at the very beginning, he was like foregoing some of like the like rich trappings of like these rooms, and he wanted to like kind of live a poor kind of life, and he wanted to feel what that is like, and like promoting that and trying to live like the common man and trying to like all of that.
Christ,
I think
like on its surface, I
don't know. Again, that's kind of notable. It's a nice thing to hear from.
I think a lot of Christians read that and probably admire it. I think it shows you that he's willing to like live a way that aligns with his beliefs.
Again, it makes me think of like a monk. It makes me think of somebody who's like choosing to forgo worldly possessions and all these different things that are temptations and all of this. And so to have a character like that in the very beginning, and then to see where the story goes with many different viewpoints, like I had no idea. Of course, it makes sense that there would be like hyper specific Italian, old school Italian conservative types that are like, we're losing it. All these other cultures have come in and tainted our Italian, because it's all
we should all still be
Vatican.
Speaking Latin. Like, why are we speaking all these other languages now?
And so I guess in general, just like hearing him build this story out from there, and like kind of some of the places he goes with it, I respect it. I think it's an interesting story, and I am really excited to see the adaptation of it, because I think it's ripe for adaptation.
Agreed. Well, let's get into what actually happens in the book. I got 3 paragraphs here I'm going to read, and we'll talk about them in chunks. We're going to start getting into spoilers for this story. I don't know. We haven't seen the film, so we don't know how it may or may not differ from that, but just be aware this may completely spoil the movie. I assume in many ways it does. So, after the sudden death of the Pope, Cardinal Jacopo Lomelli, Dean of the College of Cardinals, is tasked with overseeing the conclave to elect his successor. 4 main candidates emerge: Bellini, Tremblay, Adeyemi, and Tedesco. Tensions arise when Archbishop Wozniak reveals that the late pope had demanded Tremblay's resignation for unknown reasons. Lomelli begins to investigate and uncovers a withdrawn report that hints at corruption, further complicating the election. Meanwhile, an unknown cardinal, Vincent Benitez, arrives unexpectedly, having been created cardinal in pectore by the late pope. So that means basically this cardinal was made cardinal in secret.
Yeah.
So this is kind of the setup for the book. We get these all these different cardinals are basically being sequestered in a place for 72 hours. It ends up being, and they're going to be taking these votes like pretty frequently. They're taking votes pretty like a lot.
It's like a hung jury. It's like they just have to get a majority, like a certain percentage majority.
Yeah, like 70% or something. I forget what it is. And there's like certain percent have to get like 75 votes out of 119. I think it is something like that.
I had no idea this in pectore thing. I had no idea that was a thing, obviously. And I find that to be kind of, just to like, of course, the writer knows all of this. He's done the research, but to go out and say, this person was appointed, and for the reasons that we think at this point in the story, it makes sense. You're like, oh, someone, is in a possible place of conflict where it would like specifically like Islam is larger than the Christianity in that area.
Yeah, they're in Baghdad. That's where they're like he's serving, and like he's working with like child soldiers and people who were like sold into sexual slavery and all this stuff. So like the identity is best kept secret, I think.
The fact that the Pope can kind of travel the world and find people like this and elevate them in this way, but it's also secret. And if at any point they show up with a letter from the Pope, it's like, oh, they're legit, and they're also like a badass like war, like I don't know, like they're warriors. They're out there like on the front lines, like helping and saving.
Well, they're not warriors,
like
but they're on the front lines. Like you're saying, they're in dangerous places. Like this cardinal is serving in a really dangerous place.
Right. I think warrior is a term of like someone who's like brave. And
brave,
like
definitely doing work that's dangerous, like potentially put them in harm's way. And so this guy like he shows up. He's a secret additional cardinal they've added to the roster now, and everyone's like, "What the fuck? Where did he come from?" And then there's like, "He was made in secret." He's this Filipino from birth, but then was serving in Baghdad. Very cool. Like immediately, like a character I was very interested in, wanted to know more about. Definitely like a unique position to be in. Kind of feels like an outsider, so kind of gives you a little bit of that like as like a writing trick where you have a character who is a complete outsider to a process, to where you can kind of explain things to him because he just isn't aware. But you're in turn explaining it to the reader because we don't know, right? So a lot of the stuff around him kind of ends up explaining a lot about the procedures and how this stuff works, just because we're trying to explain how this character fits into it now. So it's a clever thing to do, and then it ends up setting up a character who ends up becoming like one of my favorites for sure.
Yeah. Well, and the mystery around this character, and then there's like a certain level of like skepticism. You're like, is this real? Is this like somebody trying to? Because it comes out
that like there's like some talk about maybe this was some sort of political maneuver,
and just in general, like we can tell that like some people are trying to hell or high water. They're trying to put their finger on the scale and decide who's going to be the next pope, and this could be a way of doing that. Another thing that I love is just like our main character Lomelli is like takes on this like investigative role through a lot of the story.
He's kind of a detective, but also like he's the administrator of this thing, so not really, but like he definitely serves that role though. He's kind of looking into the truth behind things.
And it is funny because he's kind of our main character. Mm-hmm. We're like,
he's got a little bit of a crisis of faith at times, it seems like to me, or at least he's got some struggles with it. He's been having difficulty praying. He's got some doubt about things. He's worried that he's like from the jump, he's like, I do not want to be Pope, because he technically could become one too. He's got like a kind of a weird interest in this too, because he's technically eligible to be Pope too. And he's like, I hope nobody votes for me. And then like when he does get a couple of votes, he's like, no, don't vote for me. But then people also accuse him of being biased because they're like, you're trying to win it for yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
And early on, he gives like an impassioned speech that is just like a speech about like being good to one another and looking for peace.
He had a prepared speech and he just like sets it aside. He's like, I'm just gonna speak on this.
And a lot of people like took that as like more liberal leaning from him.
Well, because he talks about like, you be a sinner and have, be forgiven, have doubts and basically humanizing the Pope. Yeah.
The way that they navigate doubt too in this story is like, I found to be like refreshing, because I think a lot of like religion, like the monolith of religion, like oftentimes the people that are in these high positions would never admit to any sort of doubt because they need to be like a pillar.
Sure.
But here, seeing them kind of internally struggle with that, and then hearing the Pope kind of convey this to a few people about how if you have doubts and then you were able to overcome them in a sense, like that is making you all the stronger for it. Again, this is just in the context of the story.
Yeah.
I don't
totally.
believe that, but
yeah, fair.
The way that that's navigated, I think, is really compelling, and it makes for these like characters who are kind of on the fence about some things, but are in these positions and want to do right by the church, the papacy, or papacy,
I guess. I don't know.
And then in general, like the world, the larger world, and like, but then also like there is some level of like self-reflection or like acknowledgement of like what the Catholic Church represents to like the larger world and some of the scandals that have gone on and some of that kind of thing. Like some characters are like grappling with that, or they directly dealt with it and they're mentioning that and they want to avoid these kinds of things. So, and then what spins out of that is like, I don't know if all of the papacy selections are like this, but tons and tons of controversy all over the place and things being covered up and big reveals, to the point that I'm like, man, if it's like this every time, then they have a lot of skeletons in that closet.
It feels like maybe they do. So let's talk about our 4 major contenders, I think, before we move on here, just so we can kind of give a kind of rough outline of who they are. So he talked about Bellini. Bellini was considered the favorite going into it. That's who all the people outside of the conclave think is going to be elected. It's only once it drags on a bit that they're like, oh, maybe he's not going to be elected. They're going to make a change. Bellini was like the successor in line. Basically, he was like, I think, kind of close friends or worked closely with the previous pope, had a lot of similar views, and was considered the most likely to become the next pope. Then we have Tremblay, who is the one that has this like report maybe about, but people don't know about it, but it's told to our main character here, Lomelli, about, him having this falling out with the previous pope. And this was all kind of secretive and didn't come out. So not a lot of people know about it. Then we have Adeyemi, who is in line to potentially become the first black pope. He is African and a traditionalist, so very staunchly conservative, anti-homosexual. I think also against like divorce, things like that are considered like pretty commonplace today even in the church, or at least they're more open to. And he is a hardliner about it, but he would be the first ever black pope, and so there's some interesting historical weight to that, and it makes him kind of an interesting character who Definitely starts rising in popularity as the book goes on. And then we have our fourth main contender, and that's Tedesco. He is the hardline conservative. I think he's the guy who's the Italian, who has like all the other Italians who like him. And he's the one who's very against all of this progressive direction things have been going, and wants to change things back to the way they were, basically. Make the church great again.
Yeah, it's funny to me because like I've said this on the podcast before, but just like growing up, I always saw like progress and like striving to be better and trying to be more inclusive, and as like things that were just inherent to life. And obviously I was a naive child, and I've learned since that that's not the way.
That's a woke mind virus talking.
Yeah. But then I see like a character like this and like literally talking about like fully wanting to bring everything about the church all the way back to like the the days when it was great, like you said, and which would be like to strip away, maybe not strip away rights, but strip away like some protections and strip away some of the acknowledgements and some of like all of that kind of stuff that goes into it. And then just goes as far as to say like, it should all just be Italy. We need to run all of this. Like we need an Italian Pope. We need to be speaking Latin. We need it all to be, because his argument is that at some point they're just going to move the Vatican somewhere else. They're going to move like the entire Catholic like stronghold to another country, and it's already gotten to this point. And it's kind like
fear mongering around that. Yeah.
It's like what's the harm in that? In a sense, I don't know. Like,
and he's just been against kind of a lot of the stuff that the church has been doing. He thinks it's been leading them astray. So those are our four main contenders. Let's talk about how the things progress. So as voting progresses, Adeyemi gains traction until a scandal involving his past relationship with a nun surfaces, ending his chances. Tremblay and Tedesco rise to the top, but Lomele uncovers that Tremblay may have orchestrated the nun's transfer to Rome to blackmail Adeyemi. A secret report confirms Tremblay had committed simony, effectively destroying his candidacy. Amid terrorist attacks on Catholic sites across Europe, Tedesco and Benitez represent starkly different visions for the church's future, Tedesco urging retaliation, Benitez calling for peace. Okay, so that flies through a lot, honestly, the majority of the book here, but let's take them one at a time. Adeyemi, the scandal surfaces about this young nun. Well, I guess she's not super young, but she was not young when they got together, and she's now older. She's working there, and what is kind of like a little convenient, maybe, Lomele happens to be sharing a wall, like he's basically next door neighbors with Adeyemi, and so he overhears them arguing one night, and he's like, "What is that?" And then he like, that's his like first inkling that something's going on, and then later she like drops a bottle of wine when they're talking about Adeyemi and like how many votes he's getting and how he's likely to become pope. And then he seeks her out, and he ends up taking her confession in kind of a clever way to get the truth out of her. And he finds out that they had this past relationship, and she had a child with him, which, if you don't know, you're not supposed to do as a as a priest in period versus, much less someone who's going to become pope, is have a baby out of wedlock and have a baby in period, because you're supposed to be celibate. So again,
this gets into Lomele becoming this investigator. It's all like in the premise here is that the doors are locked to like they cannot be interfered with from the outside world or anything like that. So at some points, like information needs to get passed and rules are being broken in some sense. But here for this first part is just Lomele trying to figure this out. And he, the way he goes about it, again, like it's like we're on his side because he's the main character of our story. But some of the time he's like towing the line for the greater good. And we're like, it's almost like when the cop in the movie is breaking laws and just breaking into people's houses and stuff, but they're saving the day.
Well, he definitely later when he goes into like the Pope's quarters, the former Pope's quarters, to like root around and look for clues.
Yes. Yeah. And again, that's like, could be explained away by like, well, God told me to do it. And because I need, and ultimately we think he's for the greater good. And it seems like the book wants it to be that way as well. But here with this scandal, it was interesting because I think Harris is playing with expectations of this character, right? Like we're thinking a black person, we're thinking like, oh, maybe more liberal minded, or maybe like in the way that he might approach the church. No, like staunchly kind of anti-homosexual. But then like some of the liberal faction starts supporting him, and they're kind of like okay with the fact that he's anti-homosexual and some of this stuff because there's like maybe
what
some
the
weight
identity
to that
might represent. Yeah. Which is definitely kind of a commentary on like the superficial nature of some of this stuff, right? Even on the left, how some of it can become superficial.
Right. He's playing with assumptions here. I think this was interesting. Gets into Joseph Tremblay you were talking about too.
Yeah, so the question becomes like, why is this nun here? She was transferred here, and the trail behind it is very kind of vague, and it's like, who brought her over here? She was just kind of like told to come, and she was actually it was kind of suggested that Adeyemi wanted her to come. But that's not the case at all. And in fact, this is what ends up leading to the discovery that Tremblay was the one behind this, because Tremblay is the one who's the most like ambitious, really wants to be pope, and knew that Adeyemi was someone who was like a direct threat to that, and so was engaging in this in order to essentially blackmail him, and also has been sort of bribing people. There's like there's a paper trail behind this. This is something the previous pope had discovered, and that's what this like falling out was over.
Yeah, that was also interesting to get that mystery revealed, because Tremblay like fully vehemently denied that there was any conversation where he was asked to step down.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's willing to lie, and then it turns out that he's straight up paying off other cardinals for their vote towards him becoming pope.
Yeah, like giving them gifts, it's like, instead of like money, it's like, oh, I'm going to let you live in this lavish house, and like things like that, right? It's corruption, just like politics, right? So this is very familiar territory in some sense. Yeah, and then that leads to this final part here where we're getting towards the end. We're getting to some very important votes, and all of a sudden there's like a terrorist attack. And it's interesting because it occurs right when Lomelli has just voted for himself for the first time. He's like, the whole time he's been like, I don't want to be pope. And then finally he's like, you know what, I'm going to vote for myself. He's kind of convinced himself that like maybe he is a good choice, or at least if it's God's will, that he's willing to take it on.
Well, and he's conflicted in the moment too, because he feels like he's like, God, send me a sign or something like that. Like he's thinking like, is this God's will or not? Am I being self-serving or not? And then the bombing goes off right
Bomb
then.
goes off
like,
right after he does
like,
it. And he's like, oh,
holy shit.
What did I do? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is another, definitely interesting. Like a bunch of terrorist attacks occur. This sort of amps up the pressure on this to, for them to come to a conclusion here, but also like shows some of the real world effects of this and how much people care. Has an interesting sort of effect on it. And then Benitez gives this sort of rousing speech about why Lomelli is actually the best choice. And is like, who's been guiding us with this, like, calm hand all along, has repeatedly put God above themselves and put, the church, God above everything. And then like,
weeded out corruption. Yeah.
Yeah. So like really like extols the virtues of Lomelli. And it seems like there's this big surge of excitement around Lomelli.
One thing I wanted to talk about too is the imagery and the way that Harris is writing about a lot of this, like, because it's all these rituals and ribbons and flowing like robes and all these other things, and the way that like they're interacting with it, I found to be pretty believable, and it helped me kind of envision it as someone who's never been in these cathedrals. Sistine Chapel is talked about, and all these other side rooms that are important.
It could have definitely gotten bogged down in those details too, but it was like just enough to evoke it well and keep things moving. While definitely, getting you a sense of place and a sense of, what you would be looking at in these scenes. Yeah.
And I love the number of times that I forget the exact wording, but it's like the sign for a cross or something like that. Constantly they're doing they're
crossing themselves. Yeah.
They're crossing themselves constantly. And like it's said with the same like terminology and words each time. Mm-hmm. And so it feels like a repetition to it. And like that again, like you can see people in these robes doing that over and over.
All right, let's get into the final bit here. So in a surprise turn, the Cardinals elect Benitez pope with a decisive majority. Just before the results are made public, Lomelli learns that Benitez is intersex, a condition he discovered only recently and had once considered undergoing surgery for. The late pope had known and supported him, secretly making him a cardinal. Despite knowing this revelation could eventually cause scandal, Lomelli decides to keep the secret, believing Benitez's election was divinely ordained and accepting him as Pope Innocent for the 14th. So yeah, a couple of big revelations here. Let's take the first one though. Just the fact that Benitez wins. This is the one thing I did see coming. As soon to me as Lomelli started like accepting that, I'm going to be Pope, and started thinking about picking a name, and I'm going to be, I forget who he picks. He's going to be John, I think. He's going to be like somebody else who's going to be kind of a liberal leaning Pope, and he had this whole reason behind the name he was going to choose. And as soon as he started embracing that, I'm like, he's not going to win. I think it's going to be Benitez, because I'm like, you could believe that people would hear this speech and think the person giving the speech is actually who we should be supporting. And Benitez had slowly been gaining votes throughout, because, you know, we were glossing over a lot of stuff, but Benitez has had a lot of good moments throughout this book.
Yeah. Well, not to mention the like putting themselves in danger, like pursuing the word of God in an area that's unsafe, like just like really putting their money where their mouth is in as far as this religion is concerned.
And it seems super trustworthy. Whenever Lomeli and Benitez would interact, like, again, this was like my favorite character even before the end of the book. I was like, oh, I love this character. I like them working together and talking to each other. They seem like, you know, good influence on each other.
Yeah, and one of the biggest moments I think for these characters too is like the reaction to the terrorist attacks.
Yeah.
So like their reactions are, what's the name of the Tedesco is very much like, we need to retaliate. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again, and is very aggressive in that way. And then the way that they navigate it otherwise is like to say like, no, we need to forgive, which is again like turn the other cheek. Mm-hmm. All of the teachings of, like it's part of at least the teachings that I'm aware of, mm-hmm. To where like that would, you know, signal somebody who's kind of selfless, like somebody who's thinking about the religion or trying to promote the word of God. Mm-hmm. So that was another like defining moment, I think, to like lead up to where we get to when eventually he becomes Pope.
So then we get the next big reveal, which I did not see coming at all. This was a complete shocking surprise. But, you know, an interesting one for sure. And that's the revelation that Benitez is intersex. And so we get elected our first intersex pope that we know of, at least. And that's a very bold way to take this book at the end.
Sure, yeah, I did not see that. And especially the kinds of people that are going to grab for this book. I assume a lot of Catholic people, whether they heard the ending or, well, I would say before they heard the ending, grabbed this. And if they're traditionalists and some of the people that we're learning about in this story, I don't know how they react to that. I
think there's been a lot of mixed reactions to it. Even like glancing at the Goodreads, there's a lot of people who were like, I love this book right up until the end, and people who like get really mad about that. So here's a quote from Harris about this. So when asked about the novel's final twist in a 2025 interview, so this is this year, Harris stated that he had expected it to be controversial, but felt it would be worthwhile. He told himself that this is what novels should do: jolt the reader, cause a commotion, make people think even if they hate it. So I think he was successful in that. I think this final twist and the shocking nature of this is one of the things that elevates this book into being something noteworthy enough that you get this major film adaptation that's getting talked about now. Like this is one of the things that takes a story like this and makes it break through. And it really shows the power of making a bold decision like this that absolutely is going to be controversial and it could get a lot of people angry. But I think this is a really cool thing because it kind of like recontextualizes the whole book up to this point, right? Because, yeah, I mean, like this Pope is Filipino, so it still would have been very notable for a Filipino man, I believe, to become Pope. I don't think that's ever happened before. And so that's already a really notable thing, right? But then the idea that this like secretly intersex Pope, that's definitely something that's never happened. And well, as far as we know, I guess I should say, I don't know definitely, but like as far as we know, so that's shocking, and that's going to shock some people, and it's going to upset some people. It's going to be considered sacrilegious, or like you said, blasphemous by some people. But it's an interesting one, and it definitely raised my eyebrows at the end of the book. I was surprised when this happened.
I like to see people take swings. Like this is the kind of thing, and like whether this works for you or not, it worked for me because I think, like you said, it recontextualizes a lot of things, and it causes some soul searching.
There's a lot of hints at this throughout. You don't really realize about sort of some androgyny that's going on in the descriptions of Benitez and, you know, all these things that you don't realize that's what's going on until you think back about it now.
I just like the way that it's going to cause a certain audience to engage with it as well, because it's like you are fully on board. This is the best man for the job.
Everybody thinks
best
this
man
is the
for
best
the
man.
Pope.
Yeah, most people. I shouldn't say everybody. Some people are probably pulling for what's the Tedesco the whole time, you know? Outside of the Tedesco hardliners, you're probably behind this. It kind of asks you, like, do you care? Like, why do you care so much? Like, should you care?
Exactly. One, do you care? But also, like, there's so much dehumanizing that goes on these days with like race, gender, sex, everything in this on all these spectrums, and like to boil something down to, this is a good person, and this is somebody who's going to do, as far as we know, the best possible job, and it's the right person for the role. And I like the messaging of that, at least like that feels like something that like I felt like I understood the author at the end of it, and I was like, okay. The whole premise of setting all of this up in all of this historical context and all the baggage that this church has behind it, to also know that there's a possibility for like change, and again, like I mentioned, like progress, like something that like opens people's eyes and makes more. I mean, can you, again, this is someone from inside baseball from the outside. I'm literally outside of the stadium, but like, can you imagine, you're only going to have more people join the faith if you are more accepting to all types of people, right? And so it's like, it's very interesting to me that you would think,
yeah,
statistically. And so like to see a statement being made like this, and that's why I was curious if this person was religious or not, Harris was religious or not.
It's really interesting the way he uses religion here too, because we talked about this whole thing, on one hand, is a political thriller about very human people, men, striving for this position that they want but don't want to admit that they want, because there's this whole element of, this is supposed to be greater than them. This is supposed to be God's will. They're all super holy. They're supposed to have lived their life a certain way to where they're very close to God, and they're like all praying, at night, and their prayers are supposed to be guiding their voting and like all this stuff, right? And so at the end, when you get the reveal, one of the things I loved was there's like a line from Benitez where he says, someone else knows about this, and that's God. And it kind of locks it into where, like, if you believe that this papal conclave is all God's will and that he won and is now about to be announced as pope, you have to believe that this is God's will, that an intersex person become pope. And who are you to argue with God's will or the Pope? You know what I mean? Like, and so it kind of uses like, it's like we see this from religion all the time, where it's like you can't argue it, and then like now it's in a position where it's something that a lot of people would want to argue with, and this kind of book says, well, you can't argue with it. In this circumstance, you would have to kind of go along with it, right? Like, it's God's will.
I also find this is a larger can of worms too, but I also find it interesting. Like, they follow so closely the word of God, but then it's been filtered through so many different people along the way, and like all these reasons why intersex would be seen as something that like, as far as the religion of Catholicism is concerned, would be like something that doesn't fit within the guidelines.
We've even talked about like other sexes other than just like men. There's not anything I don't think there was anything in the Bible that says that like a woman could be pope. Right? Like, or women couldn't be pope. I think that's said at one point, and yet it's never happened. And it's never even really been considered.
They can't even become cardinals.
Built-in stuff that, well, women in the priesthood, right? I don't think women can be priests. So like there's
and that feels like inherently, like, to me, that doesn't feel like something that's coming from quote unquote the word of God. Like, that sounds like something that human beings developed at some point, and that's like the rituals that have been continued, and it's like, some people want to hold on to that and they want it to be like that forever, and then some people want to see it be like, oh no, like, what are you actually interpreting from the word, and what like is being shown in the morality of the Bible and all these other things.
And it's really interesting choice to have this character be intersex, because it is a very controversial area of science, and not in the sense that I don't think the science is basically settled, because I think it is. It's just controversial politically. So a lot of people try and claim that it's not, right? And it's the people who are hardliners about there being a binary, and how like you can look at these sorts of situations where there is actually a gray area biologically between what we would consider, female and male, and that's this intersex area. And there's a lot of, debates about the way we talk about this and what terms should be used. The book uses, actually, I don't think the book says intersex, but I was seeing that described later. So I was using that term, but I think different people in these communities prefer different terms. But there's all kinds of different variations. Like if you pull up the, article on like Wikipedia about intersex, you'll see there's like all these different ways this can manifest, right? And it can have all kinds of different effects on the body. But the point is that there's all these different ways that people can biologically express their sex, and then their gender identity often comes down to like how they're raised, and the sort of societal pressures to conform to a certain gender. And so often people who are born intersex will still identify as either male or female, like gender, and that comes into play here too, where like Benitez has always felt like he's a man and has never really considered any alternative to that. It wasn't until much later that he even found out that like he was any different to any other man, because he didn't know, because again, this is a lifestyle where you're very puritanical and you don't, you're not seeing people naked very often. So he didn't even know. So again, it's a very complex thing to put in here, and it drops it at you at the end like a bomb.
Yeah.
And it kind of leaves you reeling as you're considering the implications of this. It's very interesting.
I think to be applauded. I think really effectively done in a way. Like I don't know that necessarily it's handled perfectly as far as like someone who is intersex reading this may feel.
Yeah, you would have to ask someone who is, because I can't tell you that.
But in terms of like what the spirit of the story is trying to do, I thought effective and powerful. And like you said, this is kind of one of the reasons why I think it's been adapted, because there's so much weight to a lot of the story, and I think a story worthy of being told, and like such a powerful one. Like we've talked about like the magnitude of it for so many different people, whether you're in the church or not, like what it means, and then what this could mean going forward. I can't wait to see how this is depicted in the movie.
Absolutely. So let us know in the comments of this video, or if you're on social media, let us know. We're just excited to hear from you, your thoughts on this book, maybe your thoughts on the film. Don't spoil anything for us if there's anything different, but definitely curious to hear people's thoughts, and really just the subject matter we've touched on here. Keep things respectful, but I think it is very interesting to discuss. I hear about people's personal experiences. I like to hear that stuff. Very intrigued. If you enjoyed our coverage, make sure to let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. And if you're on YouTube, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel. We're very close to 1,000 subscribers. Like, help us. If you're not currently subscribed and you're an audio-only listener, maybe consider popping over and giving us a subscription, because we'd love to get to 1,000. That'd be really great for our show. So, yeah, we'd love to have you over there.
And be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Blue Sky, Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film. We're also on TikTok, and we have a Discord server. If you'd like to join that, send us a message on any of those social media platforms, or an email, inktofilm@gmail.com.
And if you'd like to support this podcast in another way, we do have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/inktofilm. The most recent video that should be out when you're listening to this is a video covering our 6th season, I think, the show. We're going back to those adaptations that we did that entire year, and we're tier ranking them in a fun exercise that we like to do, where we look back and try and assign them to tiers and figure out like how we feel about them in retrospect. So it's a fun one. If you would like to check that out, that's over on Patreon.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, so I guess we should just put up some more black smoke, because we're not quite done yet with Conclave. So until next time.
I think that was blasphemous, but
probably.
Doesn't matter to me.
We've already been blaspheming plenty, I think. So until next time.
Keep adapting.